Well, Happy New Year indeed. And are you all looking forward to President Trump? Who's scared? Yeah, I'm a little scared. Definitely a little scared. Who's petrified? Come on, be honest. Yeah, right, okay, that's it. If you're in the United States just now and you read the New York Times, there's a correlate of petrified, which is hysteria. And my wife, who's German, is actually cancelling our subscription to the New York Times because she can't deal with it anymore because it's hysterical. Like, literally, I mean, and they haven't actually done anything yet, right? He's not actually president yet. And basically, you would think that what has happened is that some zombified version of a cross between Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and God knows whatever nightmare has been pulled out of the grave and has already wiped their backside with the US Constitution and slaughtered millions. None of that has happened yet. It might come to pass, but we shouldn't try and jump the gun on this one. Now, just for clarity, I am constitutionally incapable. I'm an American citizen. I am constitutionally incapable of voting Republican. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. And if I did, my wife would divorce me. So that's not going to happen, right? Very straightforward. So I'm not a Trump supporter, but I do get worried when we see hysteria. And I get worried when we see hysteria because this is very similar to a lot of what I study in financial markets. Because in financial markets, the correlates of hysteria is mania. So if you think about housing bubbles, financial bubbles, everything trending in the same direction, everyone has the same opinion. When everyone has the same opinion, I tend to take out short contracts because it usually means that they're going to be catastrophically wrong. Now, I'm not sure that's the case. There's a direct analogy here. But I do want to push back a little bit from the hysteria. Not to applaud Trump, not to say things will be better, but to actually think about that question, right? Just as a question, is the world going to be more or less risky with this guy in charge? So let's try and play with that. So this class is, I believe, called the what we were interested in was the geopolitics of risk. So I put this one up here as a little pop quiz to get us started. So what's wrong with this picture? Why is this how not to think about the geopolitics of risk? You don't have to read the whole text. It should jump out at you from the first couple of lines. What's the first line? This week in geopolitics. Let's think about how moronically stupid that is just by the title. Because you don't have to be Harold Mackinder to think that geopolitics implies some kind of structural or rather long-term process in the world rather than this week. And I think it points to a particular type of heuristic error that Danny Kahneman has written a lot about, which is an availability bias. That Trump has been elected, there are geopolitical implications, something happened this week, therefore there are geopolitical implications. I'm not entirely sure that follows. The second one is the line there, I'm not sure if you can see it, stalking the black swan with George Friedman. You must have heard of Taleb's idea of the black swan, right? So it's a high impact, low probability event that by definition cannot be known before time because there's no information in the prior data set that would tell you it's coming. All swans are white, all swans are white, all swans are white. I go to Australia, black swan. Pfft, that's it. What can you do? It's not in the prior data set. How do you hunt a black swan? You don't. It's another incredibly stupid way of looking at things. If it's a black swan, by definition, it can't be captured ahead of time. It can only happen to you. So here we have a newsletter for investors on Wall Street that they actually pay money for, that in its opening 2 lines is going to talk about Trump and risk and is based upon astonishingly faulty premises right from the start. Hysteria, sloppy thinking. Now, would standard approaches to risk help us understand his risk propensity, since America has very much taken a roll of the dice? And when we get to the Q&A, if you want to talk about all the reasons why Trump got elected, happy to go through all that stuff, but let's just focus on this just now. Well, that, of course, depends on what you mean by risk. So let's do a little bit of risk primer in terms of thinking about how this works. The little slide on the left, I think, is very great. After interviewing thousands of people, I found a strong correlation exists between being smart and agreeing with me, right? So there's a very correlative story there. And then on the other one, you've got the Mandelbrottian versus Gaussian distributions. Again, that's sort of Taleb stuff, and other people have pointed this out. So what's the point of these two slides? First one is the notion that risk is quantifiable. You already mentioned uncertainty in this. Trump, if quantifiable risk is based upon something, it's based upon a past set of data. There is no data. Right, so basically you cannot quantify this. You're in the world of deep uncertainty right from the start. So anything that you're doing is you're projecting into that inferences, which are ex ante to any data which don't exist. So you can't tell a correlative story. You can't tell a causal story. You simply don't know. So examples of this. They hired his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, is a known Islamophobe, who has at times said that war with Iran is probably a good idea. This is very scary stuff. You know who else has said that? Tony Blair, repeatedly for the past decade. Funny how we don't recognize that one, but we recognize this one. Availability bias, happening right at that moment. This one over here, even if you did have the data, the chances are that what you're looking at is a fat-tailed distribution. And I'm going to go into this in detail because I think it applies to major political events. And if this qualifies to a major political event, it essentially means that a normal distribution of probabilities, even if you had the data to calibrate it, simply doesn't apply in this case. So you have to change the way that you think about likely events under a Trump presidency, or indeed over any other extreme presidency. I'll give you another example from American politics. In the 2000 election, at a time of euphoria rather than hysteria, when the stock market had hit an all-time high, relatively speaking, and there was the dot-com bubble, and it was Bush versus Gore. It was enlightened pragmatism versus compassionate conservatism. That's what it was called, right? God knows what those things actually meant. Then what happens? Along comes a classic black swan event. You can't hunt for this, 9/11. Which opens the door to a bunch of people who take over the foreign policy apparatus, the neocons, which ends up taking us into a war in Iraq, which has been brewing and ongoing and has blown up every country from Tunisia to Afghanistan and back and continues to this day and has caused in part a migrant crisis in Europe. Now, if you had known all of the data you could have possibly wanted to know about Bush or Gore, could you have got to that conclusion? No. Now, here's the real problem on this one. There's two problems. First one's the Russian roulette problem. So you've only known me for a few minutes, but you probably figured out I'm a high-functioning psychopath. Who would like to play Russian roulette with me? I have a revolver with me. Would you like to play? Anybody? Good man. Yes, excellent. Let's go over here. Good lad. So let's think about this. Yes, I'm coming to you. I'm going to get the gun. Right. So imagine that we have the gun in front of us, right? And I'm going to give you 100,000 euros every time you click and you don't blow your brains out. Would you do it? 100,000 euros.
Well, I will do it, yeah.
You would do it. So basically what you're telling me is your risk tolerance is 500,000 for a chance of, what's the odds of blowing your brains out? What's the odds?
What's the what?
The odds, the probabilities in the picture.
That's too complex for me, that.
How many, if I put the bullet in the gun and I shape the gun, how many chambers are in the gun?
One from 10 or something?
1 from 10, 1 from 6, right? But just limited, right? So if I put the gun on the desk, you're going to look at it unless, this really is too complex, in which case you should not be playing Russian roulette, right? But you look at it and you go, okay, there's 6 chambers in the gun. There's 1 bullet. I'm not doing 100,000. I'll do 1 million. Okay, would you do it for 1 million? I mean, come on, a lot of problems are solved. 6 to 1 chance, €1 million, cash free, take it out in a bag. You want to play? What about 10 million? Would you take that chance? How many people would take the chance for 10 million if the odds were 1 in 6? None of you? You're also risk averse? Good, I'm glad. I would. 10 million, damn straight, absolutely. That solves a lot of problems. Not the world's problems, but many of my problems, absolutely, right. Now, here's the problem with playing Russian roulette with me. I might lie about the number of chambers, right? There may be more, there may be less. So imagine you only get to see the barrel of the gun. You don't get to see the chambers of the bullets. So you only get to see the outcomes of the data stream. You do not get to see the generators of the data. Now imagine I told you, private information, there's 1,000 chambers in the gun. In fact, there's a limitless number potentially. There's only one bullet and it's still 100,000. So I pick her up and I go click, 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 click. I've just made $100,000. Click, 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 click. This is great. By lunchtime, I'm a millionaire. Now, what am I doing in terms of sampling? I'm building a data stream. And what I'm implicitly doing is thinking that there has to be some kind of distribution of probabilities. Now, I want to stop before I get to the bullet, right? But I've been told there's an infinite number of chambers, so I'll keep going. And then I start to make the error that all humans do. The more data I have, the more confident I get that the next one won't hurt me. See, because I've been clicking till lunchtime. Click, 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 click. Nothing's happened so far. Click, 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 click. So I'm basically thinking that there's a mean in this distribution, and I'm thinking that the more data that I have, the more I get to know what sort of the implied mean and what the real mean of the distribution is, and they're coming together the more that I click and the more that I click. And of course, what happens is with the very next chamber, I blow my brains out. And then I don't get to collect any of the money. Now, as humans, we would say, well, you were just being greedy. You should have stopped. You'd already made 10 million. Why did you keep going? But if I think about it as a probability problem, if I got as far as 10 million, I should at least keep going to 11. But that's the one that kills you. So the other fallacy on this one, to take the Trump problem, we have no data. Let's flip it around. You can have too much data. You can overinterpret the data. You can imagine that what you're doing is building a probability distribution of likely outcomes. And therefore, you think you know how risky the world is. Unfortunately, the very next piece of data blows your brains out. So either you got too little data to say anything, or you got so much data that you're overconfident. Not a good way of thinking about risk, but tragically, that's the world that we live in. Where did I put my clicky thing? Here it is. Thank you very much. Now, next slide. Models or morons? Who gets what wrong and why? Is idiocy a useful explanatory category in public policy? Well, if you read the New York Times or any of the commentary on Trump, and I'm not defending him or his people, but it's absolutely totally fine to say that they're all idiots. They're clearly all idiots. All right? Is that useful? What exactly is the definition of an idiot? Well, they disagree with me in the policies that I like, so obviously they're an idiot, right? Can they still make means-end calculations? Yes. Did they seem to win an election? Yes. Did they surprise on the upside as far as they were concerned? Yes. So that's a pejorative. It's not a useful analytic category. Is collective idiocy possible? Is it possible for all of us because we've either got too much data and we've overinterpreted it, or there's too little data and we can't say anything, that we just fill in the blanks with whatever we fancy, usually according to our prejudices? Yeah, that's actually collective idiocy. Now, there's a little table over here I want you to have a look at, and this is sort of the frequency distributions of a normal distribution, a Gaussian distribution. So over here, we have 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, when should these happen if they're on approximate frequency for daily event? So 1 sigma deviation should happen twice a week. 2 sigmas every 3 weeks. 3 sigmas, once you're getting close to the top of the probability distribution, once a year. Then it starts to go nuts, because of course there's an exponential series. So by the time you get to 6 sigma, these events happen once every 1.5 million years, right? They're way out in the tail. They're incredibly rare occasions. During the financial crisis, the smartest firm on Wall Street, everyone knows is, come on, who's Wall Street's smartest firm? They always get it right, usually by shorting their own clients. The giant vampire squid? No clues? None of you are going to go into finance, are you? Jesus, what's wrong with you? That's where the money is. Goldman Sachs. So the chief financial officer of Goldman Sachs at the time of the crisis was called David Viniar. And David Viniar said the following: what's happening to our firm is unprecedented. We have been hit by 25 sigma events several times in the same week. Right. 25 sigma is 3 times minus the life of the universe. So it's literally impossible for that statement to have any meaning or content whatsoever. He said that what happened to him on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday has never happened in 3 times the life of the universe. That's literally what his statement said. Now, is this man a moron? Is he an idiot? What do you think? Come on, just yes or no. I promise I won't tell him. Is that idiocy or not? Tough one, isn't it? Now, the reason that he's not an idiot is because of this thing. Value at risk analysis, which basically builds giant probability distributions by sampling past data, usually about 7 to 10 years, and then saying the likelihood of something happening is 3 sigma, 3 sigma, 5 sigma, 6 sigma, 25 sigma, it'll never happen. So in terms of the statistical way that he looks at the world, sampling the past, building the probability distribution, estimating the likelihood that something's going to happen, the housing crisis was a 25 sigma event. That actually makes sense, but only if you think that makes sense. Now, if that's the standard way that we think and talk about risk and insurance and finance and all these areas, it actually doesn't make any sense at all when it comes to major, extreme, unexpected events. It doesn't. You have to lose the language of risk completely. So is the world more risky or less risky with Trump? Really depends on what you mean by risk. That's sort of the first most important point. Now, there's an essay on medium.com by Nassim Taleb, which is both brilliant and insane and insulting, and brilliant and insane and insulting. And it's called IYIs. Has anybody seen it? IYI means intellectual yet idiot. And it basically means that you know all the models and all the tools, and you went to all the right schools, and you learned all the right things, and at the end of the day, you're still an idiot. And the reason you're an idiot is because you're a slave to the models and the tools and the theories. You can only think in terms of those things. You're always sampling under the curve. And if you do that, and you surround yourself by people who always think the same way about the same stuff, then what you get is collective idiocy. And collective idiocy with really smart people is an incredibly dangerous thing, because it brings things like, oh, I don't know, the European Central Bank. That's an example of that. The euro crushing diversity across all the different economies of Europe, and then continuing to do it despite any and all evidence that the policies being followed are detrimental to the lives of millions of ordinary Europeans. That is collective idiocy en masse. And the reason you can be a collective idiot is because you don't have any skin in the game. And what we mean by this is very, very simple. There are no consequences for being wrong. So let's say that Greek pensioners, or actually Greek pensioners have the lowest rates of poverty in the country, stuffed pensioners. Young Greek unemployed people who don't have the skills or wherewithal to move elsewhere in the European Union are being systematically hurt by the policies which are being enforced by Brussels and other places. Does anyone in Brussels suffer a cost? No. So the United States drone bombs, right? We basically take these like Raptor things up in the sky and satellite guide them and drop missiles all over the place. Apart from the psychological cost of the person killing people on a video game directly, does anyone in Washington pay any costs if that goes wrong? No. And in fact, have Washington's policies, basically from 9/11 to 2003, effectively, as I said before, lit up, destabilized, or otherwise made a complete mess of every country from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria to Afghanistan to Iraq and back again with no end in sight. And America bears no costs. They have no skin in the game. And the people who are doing this think the same way, act the same way, went to the same schools, read the same books, only talk to each other. That creates a very, very thorny problem, because it's difficult to get new information into that set. Now, I'm going to set this up as a counterfactual. Let's assume that the status quo had continued, Trump had not been elected. Is that to say the world would be less risky if that's what's going on? Interesting, isn't it? Now, let's do some more probability. This is another great cartoon. I love this one. So there's a big lightning crack, boom, and 2 people. Whoa, we should get inside. And then this clever clog says, it's okay, lightning only kills about 45 Americans a year, so the chances of dying are only 1 in 7 million. Let's go on. And of course, that's his conditional probability. The annual death rate amongst people who know that statistic is 1 in 6. Because if you know that, but it's conditional on the other thing being true, if the other thing itself isn't true, or there's some way in which that doesn't hold, then you have no idea what you're doing, and you're walking through a lightning field with an iron bar. But you're completely convinced that you're not. This slide over here tells you a wonderful thing about sampling. If you go back to this one, this is the way that we think the world would like to be. Rare events, common events, sample mean, etc. Maybe fat tails. But what if it looks like this? What if it's a Cauchy or a Levy distribution? What if you've got a very, very high peak out here, and everything that you think is happening of as important is in here, but what's actually happening at a systemic level is all the way out here? You have no way of knowing. So in this panel, you're overconfident because you misunderstand the statistics. In this panel, it doesn't matter what you think about the statistics, you're simply wrong because your parameter values are completely off. We'll see how this applies in a moment. So, to take it up so far, why the standard approach to risk fails to tell us much about Trump. The first one is very simple. You're dealing with uncertainty, not risk. The first one is you don't have any data, and if you did have data, you'd overfit it, so you don't know either way. Second one, past standard models are based upon past expectations, and those expectations, if they were ever right, are now almost certainly wrong. There has to have been some kind of shift in the generators of the system that made Trump possible. It wasn't just turnout, it wasn't just the Russians hacking the emails or any excuse the Democrats want to put up, because this, and we're going to talk about this in the Q&A, is a global phenomenon. You have the Front National here. We've had Brexit. We have left and right-wing populism eating away at the major parties all the way through Europe. The average polling for the German Social Democrats now is 18 to 22%, depending on which lander you're in. They're never going to win anything. They're done. So Trump is just one example of a phenomenon, which brings us to an interesting point. What's generating this? Because the other error of either no data or too much data is to assume that you know what the generator of the probabilities are. But what if you're completely wrong about that? So insufficient sample and sample bias in what we have so far, and then the counterfactual is, would the world be less risky had Clinton won? And I'm going to go back to the skin in the game point with that one. All right, so here's a micro map of risk and uncertainty. This is how I see the world. It's a very strange way of seeing the world, but bear with me, it's okay. I only get locked up every 3 months. So imagine a world in which you've got that standard Gaussian distribution, this one, right, nice like Gauss distribution, very thin tails, invisible generators. And the payoffs to those generators, what they produce, are linear, very straightforward. Now, has anybody been to a casino? You're all so innocent. It's unbelievable. Really? Have any of you played a gambling game ever in your life? Good. Interestingly, these are also the people who are worried about Trump. That tells you something. Now, what game was it?
I remember it was a long time ago. It was in Sweden.
Did it involve a fish? It usually does in Sweden. No. Yeah, okay. Have you ever played craps? Dice? Anyone ever thrown dice? Right. That's a visible generator. So long as the dice are fair and they're not random and they don't shift through quantum worlds that we don't understand, they will have 6 sides and they will have 1 to 6 on them. So what's the maximum number you can throw? 12. You can't throw a 17. It's impossible. Life throws us 17s all the time. So we model statistical worlds. Most of the statistics we do in the world assumes these things, right? That quadrant. And Las Vegas and life insurance are probably the 2 places where that works, because no one is infinitely lived, even randomly, right? We all die, that's there, right? And Las Vegas, you play craps and other things in Las Vegas, and that's it. That's where those rules apply. Now, move along a little bit. Imagine that you have the same thing. You've got visible generators and thin tails in the distribution, but you've got convex payoffs, exponential payoffs, potentially, or at least, you know, some kind of convexity up or down. Way, that's really good. Way, that's really bad, right? So things are normal, things are normal, things are normal. Ah, Trump, right? Things are normal, things are normal. Ah, I won $1 million, right? Whichever one you want, right? So that's convexities, right? If you think about financial markets, anybody here does this sort of stuff, right? That's what options are designed to do. They're relatively simple. You get to see the generator. I buy the put or the call on the thing, and then the thing goes up or down, and I either hit the strike price and cash out or I don't, right? And if I time it right, and if I've got leverage in it, etc., whoa! And if I get it wrong, oh shit, I'm in trouble, right? That's how derivatives markets work, at least in theory. Now, let's go to a sort of a Mandelbrosian or Talebian world where you've got fat tails, and let's make it even worse. You've got invisible generators, right? So what do I mean, China affecting trade? So everyone knows that China has become a great exporter. So China is one of the leading world's exporters, behind the Germans in terms of value added, but number one in terms of volume. Do you get to see Chinese trade flows? How would you do that? Imagine you were set a task in class. Go look at Chinese trade flows. How would you do that? How would you do it? How would you find trade flows? You're all meant to be pretty smart. I'm expecting one person to answer here. Come on, give me some feedback. How would you find out how much China's exporting? Literally, how would you do it? You have a computer in front of you. How would you do it? You'd ask Google, right? And it would tell you something about exports, right? Well, okay, so that's a mediated time series. Do you believe the Chinese statistics? Do you believe the World Bank statistics?
No.
Do you believe any statistics? No. It's an extreme case, but I'll go with it, right? The point is, they are themselves replicants. They're synthetics. They're not the real thing. Now, you could go to, what's the biggest import port in France? Where do you bring all the stuff from China in? Where? Okay, so if you go there and stand on the hill outside the port, you could see Chinese trade, right? Or you'd see containers. They might not have anything in them. You don't even know, right? But you could see the containers, the cars going off, whatever. But it'd be very hard to get a global picture of that. You would want to quantify it. But then it relies upon those statistics. And do you have the data? Can you trust the data, et cetera, right? So basically, you've got a world in which you think you know what you're seeing, but you don't really get to see the thing that generates it. So there has to be a great deal of uncertainty about what's really being generated. So is China's growth 7%, 10%, 6%, or 5%? It's whatever they want to tell you. And interestingly, lacking any other way of calibrating that, what do financial markets do? They believe you. Now, last one. This is what happens when you have large financial crises. It turns out you're here, you think you've got visible generators and thin tails. Turns out you've got fat tails and invisible generators and convex payoffs. It's a shitty world, right? And a good example of this is the housing crisis. What could possibly go wrong? A credit default swap is nothing more than an insurance contract. No one ever died of insurance. If I take an options contract and embed that in that, I can make that a tradable asset. So we could make liquidity, which means that the market's more stable, right? How could that possibly go wrong? And mortgages are great because they're the safest instrument around. People live longer than their mortgage, and even if they don't, they sell them on. Housing markets always go up, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, you don't get to see the generator, you've got massive fat tails, the whole thing is incredibly uncertain, and all it needs is one push, and the whole thing goes. Another one, wouldn't it be great if Europe had its own currency? Because that would encourage economic conversion amongst these diverse regions. And then we would actually all have a focal point for our common European identity, and then national boundaries would be eroded, and then we'd all start speaking Esperanto or something like that, right? And it'd all come together, it'd be great. What it actually did, of course, was to encourage savers in the north who are old to send money to borrowers in the south so that they could buy the goods from the north on credit. And when the capital flows stopped, everyone in the north said, I want my money back. And they said, we don't have any money. That wasn't written into the script because you weren't looking at the generators. They were there. You could have looked at them, but nobody wanted to. Why do central banks not look at asset inflation? Well, we don't know if there's a housing bubble. Really? My cat, Biggie, knew there was a housing bubble, and he lived in Baltimore. I don't think this is a question of science. This is a question of willful ignorance. This is intellectual yet idiot. Let's make it even worse. So that was the micro. This is the macro. So this is from Chuck Perot's original work, and then there's a wonderful book that just came out by a guy called Galen, which is Architecture of Collapse. Short book if anybody's interested in it. It's well worth reading. So the basic idea here is if what I was giving you there was in a sense the micro-cognitive level of how we think about the world, and we think we live in Las Vegas, but most of the time we really bounce between the latter two quadrants, and when it goes horribly wrong, we're in the bottom quadrant. This is the macro side of this. So imagine a system that's very low complexity and is loosely coupled. So you've got simple bits that don't interact and are not bound to other simple bits, right? What would that be? You end up with a world where you have linear interactions with buffers, and it's hard to transmit shocks. So if you think about a banking system, this is what the New Deal banking regulations were designed to do. So investment banks had firm rules about what they could do, and they couldn't do anything else in someone else's space. Mortgage finance was done by savings and loans. That's what they did. Commercial banks did basically loans to businesses and underwriting. That's what they did. No one was allowed to cross the streams. By doing that, you create very, very simple organizations which have dedicated purposes. What that means is in 1985, when the US has a savings and loan crisis, the entire savings and loan pillar of the financial sector falls. It doesn't harm the rest. There's a huge degree of redundancy in that system. It's not very efficient, it doesn't optimize, but there's an enormous amount of redundancy in it. Now, go to the next one, and you've got low complexity, but it's tightly coupled. So you've got linear interactions without the buffers, and you get a transmission of shocks. But it doesn't mean that everything goes exponentially good or exponentially bad. If we think about the 1970s oil shocks, that's when we discover interdependence in the world economy. Because we think about these economies as being separate, but if you basically quadruple the price of oil as an input at a time when all of these economies are heavily industrial economies, you generate an enormous inflation shock through the system, which affects all of them in slightly different ways. But nonetheless, you've got exactly that criteria of it's coupled, so you all get it, but the payoff to it isn't multiplicative, right? It's just sort of, it's like a virus being transmitted in that sense. Now, go down to this one. Stay with me on this. I know it's a bit tedious because I'm going to bring it all together at the end. Oh, damn, that was stupid. There we go, that's better. Enough, I'm done. You bored? I'm bored too. I'm boring myself at this point. All right, high complexity, loose coupling, basically what do you get down here? This is the internet. So parts of the internet can go down. Denial of service activities to different internet sites. But what you've got there is a site where basically the internet itself is loosely coupled, although it's a complex network, and it's extremely complex. But you have the same characteristic of silo banking. Essentially, when one bit goes down, the whole thing doesn't go down. Right? So it's different system dynamics, but it plays out the same way. Now, where you want to be here, of course, this is the correlate here. You've got tight coupling, high complexity, nonlinear reactions, massively strong convexities. That's the financial crisis. Everything that was meant to be separate turned out to be correlated. Everything that was meant to be nothing to do with each other had massive things to do with each other. So the first slide, to go back, that's how you think about the world. Second slide, that's how you build the world. Got it? Let's bring it all together. So imagine a world in which we put these things together, where you have low complexity, thin tails, loose coupling, simple payoffs, and put this in the world of politics of a president who happens to be Donald Trump. There are no real world examples. Unfortunately, he doesn't legislate in Las Vegas. Right? Everything that he does is an environment where simple payoffs do not apply. Everything is related to everything else. And you've got low complexity and thin tails. Nah, sorry, doesn't work like that. Now, where is it that he does live? He actually lives in these two quadrants. And this is most of what he's going to try and do. So imagine you've got low complexity, thin tails. That is to say, it's simple, and the probability distribution isn't totally skewed, right? When you've got data, you're kind of getting an idea as to what the world looks like. And over here, it is definitely tightly coupled. Lots of things are joined together, and they affect each other, and the payoffs can be convex. Immigration policy, classic example, right? So he's going to build a wall, right? He's not going to build a wall. He's going to do some bullshit, right? But basically what he's also going to do is it's going to be really, really bad for like particularly Mesoamerican and Latin American immigrants, right? Simple as that. We know this. Massive downside for that constituency. But we know he's going to get that through Congress because the Republicans have wanted to do something about it for ages. So they will not oppose him on this one. And the Democrats will go nuts, and in my case, all right-thinking people will go nuts because it's an anti-cosmopolitan nationalistic affront. We'll take that under advisement, right? But he's going to get away with it. Something will happen there, and it's because of the nature of the environment, right? The convexities are to people who are going to bear costs that he doesn't care about. So there can be convex payoffs, but not to him, not to his insiders. And once you've passed that law to the vast majority of Americans who give a shit about border security, it doesn't really affect them. So you know that he's going to tread in that space. Now, what else is in that space? Infrastructure. How's he going to fund infrastructure? He's going to basically get American companies that have totally about 700 billion, 800 billion stashed abroad in unpaid taxes to bring them home. And he'll tax them at 20%, and then he'll drop the corporation tax rate to 10%. At that point, Luxembourg and Ireland both blow up because the little game they've been playing in the global economy for the past 25 years, good night and good riddance as far as I'm concerned, particularly Luxembourg, which is scum of a place. Highest per capita GDP in the world, and it's basically a bunch of pig farms, right, and tax dodges. It's a total disgrace. I mean, people worry about, you know, the Cayman Islands and all this sort of stuff. That place is just way more disgusting, and it's in the heart of Europe. Oh, and by the way, who's the guy who used to run Luxembourg? What does he do now? Hmm? Yeah, what does he do now? He's the head of? Yes, exactly. Jean-Claude Juncker, head of the European thing, whatever it is. Anyway, no, it's great. We're all like, yeah, he's the European guy. That tells you a lot, really. Anyway, keep going on, right? Taxes. He's going to get tax reform done the same way, right? Basically, the insider payoffs to getting a tax cut, which is basically people like me, I'm going to say we shouldn't do it. I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to hand back my tax return. And the budget deficit that it creates and the problems that it creates is going to be for other people. So the convexities will be externalized onto someone else. Now, go down here. This is where it gets more fun. You've got loose, complex, simple payoffs, but high complexity and fat tails. You think you know what you're doing. You think you know how the payoffs are going to work out. You think you know who's going to end up bearing the costs, but you probably don't. So what's that one going to be? This is actually dealing with Congress in general. He's going to have more problems with the Republican Party than a Democratic president. Because at the end of the day, he wants to do some very un-Republican things. He wants to spend money. Now, he'll get to spend whatever he gets in taxes on infrastructure, but he wants to spend a lot more than that. And he wants to really reinvest into the heartland states and move move federal functions there, a whole bunch of stuff, right, that the Republicans are going to oppose. And they're going to oppose because they're tied in, tightly coupled, to lots of other things the Republicans like already, and that he is indirectly threatening. So his room for maneuver, once he moves from this quadrant down to this quadrant, all right, it's going to be very, very constrained. And the same thing's going to happen with the judiciary. Because there is a thing called the Constitution in the Supreme Court, and even though it's run by Roberts, they take their job seriously. And he will not be able to just tear up bits of the Constitution he doesn't like and throw them in the trash. There will be constitutional challenges. He might even be impeached. This could all be over in 2 years. We're going to have to see how this plays out. We don't know. But that's when he starts to get into trouble. Now, here's the dangerous bit. This is the fear factor. Tight couple, convex payoff, high complexity, fat tails, nonlinear interaction, strong convexities. The world. Welcome to foreign policy. This is dealing with China. This is dealing with Russia. This is when you think you know what's going on, you really are sure how the world works, and it comes up and black swans you right in the ass. He is not well equipped for dealing with this. It's a very, very, very risky world, and that sense of risk. And what I can discern so far from Trump in terms of whether, you know, he's going to be more or less risky is the following. He's actually quite predictable. I know he's going to do this stuff, and he's probably going to get away with it. I know he's going to try and do stuff here, and he's probably not going to get away with it. He's going to do stuff here, and that's when I get worried. Right? That's the fourth quadrant. That's when you think you know what you're doing because you've got models and data and statistics and preferences and all the rest of it. But they're wrong. They're by definition wrong because the environment is not the one you think it is. All the stuff you think would be right? I'm going to put up tariffs on China. They can just deal with it. If you live there, if you live in Las Vegas, right, you can do that. But you don't live in Las Vegas. You live in the doomsday machine quadrant. So once you start putting up tariffs, it's not just a question of they put up tariffs in retaliation. They might do something like, oh, I don't know, chuck some missiles at Taiwan. And then the minute you do that, we have an agreement with them that if they ever do that, we have to come to their rescue. So then you get embroiled in an actual shooting match over tariffs. Massive convexity, definitely non-linear. That's why he worries me, not because of the other stuff. Now, why assume the standard models are wrong? Let's be honest and let's go through all the things that we have got wrong over the past 15 years in terms of the establishment view of the world. And then we get an insight into why people like Trump are increasingly popular, right? So in economics, we had the Great Moderation. Who can tell me what the Great Moderation was? You don't talk much, you lot, do you? No? Dialogue, don't give feedback, no? What was the Great Moderation?
I think it was the fact that the central banks wouldn't have grant lower interest rates so that the budget policies of countries would be limited.
Exactly. So that what you've done is you've abolished the business cycle. So writing in 2003, 2004, Bernanke, who was the head of the central bank after the Greenspan retired shortly after, writes this celebratory article about how central banks have abolished the business cycle. The hubris is astonishing. Now, what happened? Well, you have abnormally low interest rates and low inflation coinciding, and they think they caused this. Well, if they caused it with their policies, then a reversal of their policies should cause high interest rates and high inflation. They haven't been able to hit their targets for the past 8 years, and they have no idea what's going on. Next one, everybody wins from globalization and free trade. Right, that's been contested somewhat, and not just by the anarchist left. So go to David Otter's site at Harvard and look up China shock. And you can take a thing over a map, and you can go by how many dollars that district has lost because of trade with China. Real dollar terms, how much it's cost them. All right? So not everybody gains, but that was the one we were told. Central banks and inflation target have produced positive growth? Nah, no. Banks are the best judges of risk. Before the financial crisis, that was the policy orthodoxy, because they had skin in the game, right? No, they didn't. They had other people's money in the game. That's very different from having skin in the game. And when your bank goes bust, if you're too big, you get bailed out and you never lose your job. Let me give you some statistics on France from 2012. The top 3 French banks are, can you name them? In terms of asset footprint, their size. Yep. And? Crédit Agricole, which used to be a goddamn farmer's bank. Think about this, right? The asset footprint of those banks added together in 2012 was 232% of French GDP, which meant if any one of those went down, it would have taken the entire French economy with it. And you don't have a printing press anymore because you're in the euro. That's incredibly short-sighted. It also basically means that the French taxpayer becomes an option for the banking system. So the minute that they get into trouble, you're just going to bail us out. And that's what happened everywhere. How did we get that so wrong? Oh, I won't even go into austerity economics. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it. You can have a look if you like. Foreign policy, the disaster of liberal humanitarian interventionism. Beginning in 1992 with Somalia, the United States got it into its head that basically it should invade places and kill people to make them more stable. It was no longer imperialism. It was done because we were great humanists. We were liberals. We were going to go in there and fix them. We tried that with Iraq. Didn't work out too well. Who are we backing in Libya? Does anybody even know? What about Egypt? We backed the democracy to get the brotherhood, and then we applauded when the military kicked them out. Right? This is a disaster. That whole region is in chaos, and the migrants crisis here is in part the result of that. EU, NATO writing checks it cannot cash all the way up to the Baltics. In 1961, General de Gaulle famously said, "I'm not joining NATO because I don't believe it's a credible promise. They're not going to swap Paris for New York. It's never going to happen." Do you think you're going to swap Washington for Tallinn? So you give F-15 fighters to a bunch of people who basically do money laundering for the Russians, because that's a large part of what they do. And you get them to buzz and bother the Russians, and you do the Ukraine strategy, and you expand all the way up to the borders of the most security-sensitive country in the world, and you expect them to be okay with it because it's in the name of democracy and human rights. Seriously. Underestimating other states' responses. Why do you think China and Russia behave the way you do? But we're completely incapable of saying this because anything we do is done for good motives. So it must be them that's wrong. The idea that Russia hacked the election and won it for Trump, it's just the latest example of this. It's like, really? They might well have done that, but you would have lost anyway. It really had nothing to do with it. Sorry, no chance. And then the last one, of course, is what is US foreign policy at this time? I like to call it drone whack-a-mole. Whack-a-mole is a little game where things pop up and you hit it, and you hit it, and you hit it, and when you hit them all down, eventually that's it. That's drones. It doesn't go anywhere. You just end up escalating more and more killing with no responsibility. Now, if that's the world that we actually inhabit, if that was the status quo that was going to continue once Clinton got elected, is it any wonder people lose faith in the elites? Which one's actually risky? Because I've got a world now that I don't know, and if I do calibrate data, I know I'm wrong. So that's my Trump world. So I've got every reason to be fearful. But I actually have a huge amount of relatively accurate data on the world that came before. And as far as I'm concerned, on the economic side, you're a bunch of charlatans. And on the foreign policy side, you're a bunch of cowboys. So I'm not sure which one's better and which one's worse. Now, what's the conclusion of all this? We can say that with Trump, given no real data and high uncertainty, all outcomes are 50-50. In honest terms, that's all you can say just now. You simply don't know. He's about to be president soon. That distribution is going to change. But the key thing is that fourth quadrant. Where he wants to do most of his stuff is the area in which the interactions are not linear, they're tightly coupled, they have fat tails, they're likely to have big convexities, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and that's going to cause problems. But a large part of what he's going to do is actually quite predictable, and it's quite predictable how it's going to play out. Again, a minor thing that most people don't appreciate, the President of the United States cannot introduce legislation. Congress has to introduce legislation. There's a huge break on what presidents can do, as Obama found out. Second one, given the environment in which things could go badly, let's not even talk about his Twitter twitch, right? Sitting on the golden throne tweeting at 3 o'clock in the morning. So no doubt the world will be riskier in a very different way that we can't quite price, but it's those fourth quadrant effects that I worry about. Well, would things be less risky under Clinton? Again, stability. Well, we would have continued to blow up the Middle East, hand the problem to the Europeans, and had no real solution for it. Judgment. This is the one that kills me. You take $650,000 twice to go to Goldman Sachs to tell them about finance. They know about finance. You want to be president. That means you're going to be in charge of reforming Wall Street. But you can't resist the cash, can you? Because if you had any sense, you would know that the minute you walk in that room, you're compromised. Because you're going to sit there and tell them, as Clinton did, that you're the guys that we need to talk to figure out how to make finance work for everybody. Really? I thought they were the bastards that ripped everyone off. I must have mistaken them for someone else. So when you walk in there, and you give these speeches for a cost of $1.2 million, you've compromised yourself in your ability to produce financial reform when you're president. So the guys at Goldman, very clever. Rather than wait until she's president and then see all this stuff coming down from Elizabeth Warren that they're going to have to spend billions trying to fight, why not just bribe her right now, put the transcripts in the safe, and I've got an insurance policy against this ever happening. Now tell me about judgment. Economy. Absolutely no consideration of the stuff that's been driving Trump, Brexit, or the revolt here, everything in Europe, the whole lot. The entire anti-globalization, the entire left behind, wage constriction, wage poverty, wage dispersal, inequality, nothing. If it wasn't for Bernie Sanders, they wouldn't even talked about it. And then the last one, foreign policy. A week before the election, Senator Clinton proposed putting a no-fly zone over Syria. That's tantamount to a declaration of war against the Russian Air Force. Did anybody notice that? You want underpriced risk? Try that. Because the thing about the Russian Air Force, and I'll tell you this for a fact, if you shoot at them, they will shoot back. They're not going to take that one lying down. So, what do I think is likely to happen with Trump given this analysis? Let's go back to this one. And which is he unlikely to succeed? As I said before, here he's more likely to succeed. Here he's less likely to succeed. And here is the uncertainty. Here is the most complex area. Here is the biggest potential for bad outcomes. We simply don't know, but that's where to look. It's not here, and it's not there. It's there. So, depends what you mean by risk. Much of what he's doing is predictable, not risky in a technical sense, apart from Twitter. He will do tax reform, healthcare reform, tax cuts, infrastructure, all predictable. But it's the massive uncertainty generator in the fourth quadrant, that's the problem. So it's probably a good idea to buy tail risk insurance. So insurance for those fat tails, those black swan events. What does that actually look like? This is what it looks like. Are you ready? This is tail insurance for Trump. It's 3 flights to New Zealand. Because that's where I'm going if it all goes crap. So there you go. What's one for my wife, one for me, and one for my daughter. Bye, we're gone. My brother lives in New Zealand. It's really nice apart from the earthquakes. Trump, earthquakes, you figure it out. All right, I'll stop there and then we can chat.